Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out this morning, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of my experiences on the Tongass. Um, I grew up on an island in Washington State, Orcas Island. My dad started the first air service in the San Juan Islands and used boats and airplanes in his business, taught both my brother and I to fly and operate boats, which turned out to be a really important thing in Alaska because I've been a pilot for 50 years. I flew with the Department of Fish and Game, used airplanes and boats in my research, and Alaska is just really a great place. We moved to Alaska in 1976 to Anchorage for 9 months, and then I went down to Juneau, where I was a research biologist for 12 years studying black-tailed deer, mountain goats, and brown bears. And then I moved up to Fairbanks for 3 years, where I supervised research in northern Alaska, and then back to Anchorage, where I was a senior conservation biologist. I retired in 1996 from Fish and Game, went to work for Audubon for 14 years. Been retired since 2011, but I still seem to get involved in these things. So I'm going to share with you, can I hit the clicker? We've had some technical difficulties, so maybe, there we go. This is the Mendenhall Glacier in Juneau, and we spent the first year in a duplex and decided that we really didn't want to live in suburbia. So we looked for waterfront land, but it was way too expensive for us. So where the X is the tip of the Mendenhall Peninsula. The airport is right this way. That's the west end of the airport. We bought an acre of land, and there we go. We built our own home. We barged the Lincoln logs. It was a cedar home. We barged it out to our site at Smuggler's Cove, and then shortly thereafter we started having kids, and there we go. And that's Mary. But we lived off the grid. We didn't have electricity or telephone for about 3 years, and we put in our own water system, stern. And this was the little skiff that we went back and forth about half a mile to the end of the road. Our two kids, Eric and Sarah, and we've had lots of great experiences in Alaska. Explorations from flying up and landing in the up in the tundra in the Alaska range. That's Denali in the background. We had caribou coming right through our little camp. Whoops, let's see here. A picture here, that's up in the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge. And over here is out at Round Island, the state game sanctuary for walrus. And that's Eric, our son, and he was in junior high then, and Sarah was in elementary school. Those are all walrus. And I think our kids didn't have a fair shake because Eric turned out to be a fisheries biologist. He's a professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and he'll speak next week. And that's Sarah, and she's a seabird ecologist with Alaska Science Center here in Anchorage. They both have 2 kids, so we've got 4 grandchildren in Alaska. We're very delighted. So, what I'm going to try to do today is lay the groundwork, give you a little idea of from where I'm coming from. I've been here for 48 years, studied all over the state, mostly in the Tongass and up in the Arctic, and I just want to give you the lay of the land. This is what Alaska is all about. So that's what I'm doing today. Tomorrow, or next week, Eric will be talking about Alaska salmon, and he's very involved. He's working on Yukon kings right now, which is a big deal, if you're all aware of that. The next talk will be on Alaska bears. I studied brown bears in Southeast Alaska for 10 years. They're amazing creatures. I'll cover polar bear, brown bear, which I studied mostly, and black bear. Then the Tongass National Forest, we'll have a session on that. I'll be joined by Matt Kirchhoff, my colleague of about 40 years. Then conservation in Arctic Alaska. International conservation efforts in Russia. Margaret Williams will present that. She just came back from a fellowship at Harvard University. And then Rick Sinnott, the longtime area biologist here in Anchorage, who's now retired, he and I will talk about wildlife management in Alaska. Rick was one of the best area biologists the state ever had, and we'll focus on the state's intensive management program. And then finally, I'll be joined by Eric Myers, Pat Porchot, and Eric Davinchin, and we'll talk about key goals and policies for balancing conservation and resource use in Alaska. Eric, raise your hand. If you want to know something about conservation policy, talk to Eric. He's great. So, here we go. To me, the thing that makes Alaska so unique and outstanding in this country, but perhaps more internationally, is that we've got vast areas of intact marine and terrestrial ecosystems. And that's the Arctic ice pack, and we'll talk more about that in a couple of sessions. Alaska represents 18% of the total US land base. You know, we're big, you all know that. 366 million acres. This is the Uticok uplands of the Western Arctic on the western edge of the National Petroleum Reserve, and I'll talk about that in a session on the Arctic. This is just a key factor. Alaska, 87% of Alaska is public land, mostly federal land, but state land and native corporation land. Key land milestones. Of course, we purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, the Alaska Statehood Act, and this is significant. 1959, we got a late start, but that has significant ramifications for conservation. You know, we have about 75 years of intensive resource development in Alaska. In the US, you know, the Pacific Northwest, they've got about 100 to 150 years. On the East Coast, about 300 years. You can do a lot of development in 300 years. So we're just at the beginnings, which give us some great opportunities. Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in 1971, this was done primarily to resolve indigenous land claims and then get the pipeline built. So BLM conveyed 45 million acres of public lands to Alaska Native corporations and shared a payment of almost $500 million. That was a big deal. Then in 1980, we passed, Congress passed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, or ANILCA. And this provided varying degrees of protection for over 157 million acres, which included national parks, national wildlife refuges, national forest lands, and so on. This is a big deal. It really sets Alaska apart from the rest of the country. This is an interesting map. You can see the yellow patches are native corporation lands. The purple patches are state of Alaska lands, and the green are federal lands. So quite different than what you'd see in the lower 48 states. And here we have just a little closer look. We've got in the light green, US Fish and Wildlife Service refuges. There's the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. There's the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge, Selawik, Yukon Delta Refuge, and close to home, Kenai, and then down to here, Kodiak. There are others. Park lands. This is Gates of the Arctic National Park. This is Noatak Preserve. Denali, of course. This is Wrangell St. Elias, Glacier Bay, Lake Clark, Katmai, and then this is the Kenai Fjords. So pretty amazing. We've got all of these lands that have varying degrees of conservation. This area is the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, NPRA. It's 23 million acres. It's the largest block of public lands in the United States. And there's major oil deposits there. There are also incredible wildlife and subsistence resources there. And the trick is to try to balance that. So I spent 12 years on the Tongass, working for the state of Alaska. The Tongass and the Chugach forest, the Tongass is almost 17 million acres. The Chugach is about 5 million acres. The Tongass is the largest national forest in the nation. And the Chugach is the third largest. A lot of people think it's second, but it's real close. But it's the most northerly national park. And between these two national forests, they represent a significant portion of the temperate old-growth rainforest. And I'll get into that in great detail on the discussion on the Tongass. 70% of our nation's national park lands occur in Alaska. That's remarkable. And this is Gates of the Arctic National Park, the south slope, just north of Bettles. Sure, I could try that. Okay, along with my hurricane. How's that work? Okay, that's going to make it too loud. It's too loud. I've got a loud voice. Okay. Okay. So we're making progress here. 80% of the nation's national wildlife refuges occur in Alaska. Pretty remarkable. Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, these refuges hold amazing habitat for fish and wildlife in our state. And then more than half of the nation's wilderness occurs in Alaska. This is Icy Bay and Wrangell St. Elias National Park. That's Mount St. Elias there. This is really, talk about wilderness. This is just remarkable. So Alaska's wildlife aren't just important to Alaska. They have global and statewide significance. This is the Copper River Delta. Over 60% of the nation's wetlands occur in Alaska. And the Copper River Delta has the greatest concentration of shorebirds. Many are flying through and they stop over in the Copper River Delta. But 60% of the nation's shorebirds stop off in the Copper River Delta. We have 80 species of waterfowl and shorebirds in Alaska, numbering 20 million birds. The big flock are western sandpipers, and the little bird on the lower right is a western sandpiper. These pictures were taken in Cordova. If you've never been to the Cordova Shorebird Festival, I absolutely recommend it. Or Kachemak Bay in Homer in May, usually early May. These are swarms of birds. It's just amazing. There's a Hudsonian godwit down here, a black oyster catcher in the rocky shorelines, a golden plover, and golden plovers and humpback whales are very intelligent. We have something to learn from them. They both spend their winters in Hawaii. Anyway, that's smart shorebirds. Okay. So waterfowl, trumpeter swans, picture taken at Potter Marsh, and some of you are aware that we've had a nesting pair of trumpeter swans in Potter Marsh for, I think, the last 6 or 7, 8 years. This year they fledged 4. They had originally started out with 8. The bald eagle nesting there got a couple of them. But these are amazing birds, and we've got a long-tailed duck here, a harlequin duck up here, a common goldeneye, and a white-fronted goose. And we have amazing numbers of waterfowl in Alaska. This is another superlative. Alaska's tidal shorelines amount to 46 1,000 miles longer than all the lower 48 states combined. That's looking south from the mouth of Resurrection Bay. And we've got 66 species of seabirds, numbering somewhere around 100 million. I mean, Alaska's on the global map for waterfowl and shorebirds and seabirds. This is really amazing. So parakeet auklets from the Pribilofs there on the left, red-legged kittiwakes, you can see the red leg right there, and tufted puffins, and of course, we've got horned puffins, and if you've been out on the Kenai Fjords boat tour, you've seen the puffins and a number of other species. So Alaska's coastal waters support 32 species of marine mammals, from walrus to humpback whales and bowhead whales and beluga whales out here in Cook Inlet. It's, no other state can compare. Few other parts of the world can compare to this. Here we've got stellar sea lions on the Needles in Prince William Sound. This is a northern fur seal in the Pribilofs, a Kachemak Bay otter, and a humpback whale down in Frederick Sound in southeast Alaska. Mary Beth and I were on a boat in Frederick Sound one time, and we estimated that there were over 100 humpback whales all around us. And we just shut the boat down, and we had whales come up from me to dawn. Really remarkable. So Icy Strait in northern southeast, Frederick Sound in the middle of southeast. These are great areas for humpback whales. And you're going to learn more about this tomorrow, but Alaska is the global hotspot for salmon. Salmon have declined around the world. And if any of you are interested in learning the history of salmon, I recommend the book King of Fish. It's an amazing book by a University of Washington professor about the demise of salmon around the world, and Alaska is the last stronghold. Salmon anchor the productivity of south coastal Alaska. Certainly in southeast Alaska, where I did my work, up in Prince William Sound, Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay, the largest red salmon production in the world. Did you know that salmon and salmon eggs provide food for around 200 species of vertebrates and invertebrates? Just amazing. From marine mammals to bears and wolves and marten and mink and river otter to rodents and shrews and songbirds and crows and jays and ravens and, of course, bald eagles, you name it. Alaska in the United States is just unique in that we have robust populations of apex predators. These are the animals that are at the top of the food chain. That's a Denali grizzly bear, a Kenai Fjords black bear, a Denali wolf, and an orca whale from southeast Alaska. And there's no other state in the Union, of course, that has all 4 species of North American bears. We're going to learn a lot more about that in the 3rd session. After Eric gets done with salmon, then I'll hit bears, and there's a correlation there. So, people, Alaska, Anchorage, I think around 290,000 people live in Anchorage, and St. Paul Island up here in the Pribilofs, about 400 people. Sitka's about 8,000, and Kotzebue's about 3,000. We have the second smallest population in the country. I think Wyoming has a little smaller population than we do. Alaska population, 734,000. It's 0.2% of the US population. Just think about that. I mean, we're huge, but we're 0.2 the US population, which is 333 million. This is fundamental to what I'm talking about. Alaska's population density, 1.3 per square mile. The US density is 111 per square mile. Those are of a year or two old. Just to compare, California's population density, 251 per square mile. Boy, you can see that people in California have a much different impact on the resources and the landscape than we do in Alaska. Of course, for 10,000 years, the indigenous people of Alaska have depended on natural resources. They've lived in harmony with the land. And this is very significant. And I think the bottom line is that Alaska is characterized by large, intact watersheds, ecosystems with all their ecological parts. And I'm just going to mention here that the difference between California and Alaska, you know that. It's a huge difference. And these large intact ecosystems that have all their parts is significant. And I'm going to mention shifting baselines. There's a TED Talk by Daniel Pauly of UBC where he's looking at salmon, or he's looking at fish actually. What we have in Alaska today is a result of industrial development that took off about 75 to 50 years ago. In the Pacific Northwest, it took off about 150 years ago. On the East Coast, it took off about 300 years ago. And then you go to Europe. So it depends on what you're talking about right now, what you have in terms of resources that relate to conservation. We'll talk more about shifting baselines in the Tongass talk. But that's significant. How many of you know who Aldo Leopold is? Just raise your hand if you've ever heard of him. Okay, a bunch of you. Aldo Leopold is really the founder of wildlife science in North America, and he was a major player in conservation globally. And this is what Aldo Leopold said. The first principle of conservation is to conserve all the parts. I'm a devotee of this. I really believe that Alaska is one of the few places on Earth today where we can still conserve all the parts, that the ecosystems are intact and they're functional, much as they were, 1,000 years ago. We've lost very few species to extinction. Okay, I need some help back there. Need to advance the slide. Thought we had all these technical difficulties resolved. Okay, thank you. So I want to talk briefly about some conservation challenges, and we'll get into these in more detail in further sessions along the way. This is a picture of Mary Beth and I, our first trip to Alaska over 50 years ago. 1970, in front of the Columbia Glacier, we were assistants to a wildlife photographer. And we drove up the Alcan Highway and we launched 2 Avon rubber rafts. His was a little bit bigger than ours, but this, I think, was 14 feet with a 25-horse outboard. We went from Valdez, Columbia Glacier, we camped on Heather Island, then we went to Cordova. He took off down the coast on a research boat and we went back to Valdez. I don't recommend that. We were visiting the Columbia Glacier a few years ago on our 36-foot trawler, and that was much nicer. It rained every day, by the way. So I want to talk about climate change. This is fundamentally important to Alaska. The Columbia Glacier, and we camped on Heather Island, which is down below, outside this photo, but the Columbia Glacier has retreated 12 miles and lost half of its volume since the early 1980s, excuse me. Most of the glaciers in Alaska are retreating. Now, I remember going to Portage Glacier back in 1976 or so, and you walked into the visitor center, you had a nice movie, and then they opened the curtains and you're looking right at it. You sure don't do that today. I've done a lot of flying around Alaska, and I've seen amazing change in my almost 50 years of flying relative to glacier extent. So climate change is occurring. Bear with me. I'm going to walk you through this. It's not complicated. 800,000 years ago to today. This was carbon dioxide parts per million. This is 300 parts per million in 1911. And then this is based on ice core data. And then modern instrumentations began here. And today, we're 420 parts per million. You can see, boy, it just went pretty high and is continuing to go. So that's carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, it has a greenhouse effect. It covers the lower atmosphere and reflects solar radiation back. Methane has a much higher impact than carbon dioxide. So just looking from 1880 to 2020, 2022 actually, and I'm going to walk you through this. This is the 1951-1980 average global temperature right here. And you can see that, you know, about 1970, 1980, it started to climb. Look at that. And, you know, that's following CO2. It's real. And it's impacting Alaska. And look at the hurricane that just happened. The warmer the ocean water is, the more water evaporates into the atmosphere, and you have these tremendous hurricanes and weather changes like atmospheric rivers. I was tired of the atmospheric river this summer, believe me. Okay, annual temperature change over the past 50 years in Alaska. Well, you see down in the rainforest, southeast Alaska, up the coast, you know, it's increased in temperature, you know, 2+ degrees Fahrenheit. Then you get into south central Alaska, 3 degrees Fahrenheit as you move north over this 1974 to 2023, you know, we're up here, the temperature change is 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Significant changes. And generally, the Arctic has increased temperature 4 times faster than the global average. That's affecting Alaska. And I'm going to get into that more with polar bears in the Arctic presentation that'll come up later. Resource development. Under the Arctic, we'll get into what's going on in Prudhoe Bay and NPRA and some of the areas up there. There's some significant changes, and I recognize that oil and gas have brought great wealth to Alaska. We just need to figure out how to balance them. I think balance is the key. We'll talk more about that. Industrial mining, the same thing. You know, there's a proposal that's just been in front of us for many years about the Pebble Mine in Bristol Bay, and the University of Washington fisheries folks really see some significant challenges there. And we're not finished with that yet, but Bristol Bay sockeye salmon are, you know, it's just no place in the world like that. Clear-cut logging and road building. I've spent a lot of my career looking at this issue with black-tailed deer and mountain goats and brown bears and other species. And, you know, one interesting comment, sidelight I have, is that, checking my time, is that I started out looking at individual animals and their relationship to forest and logging. And as I got into this longer and further, I realized it's not about individual species, it's about the ecosystem. All the parts, they all go together. And we still have an opportunity in Alaska to conserve all the parts. Another resource development activity that's kind of a double-edged sword. You may have seen the front page of the Daily News today about tourism in Juneau. There's a difference of opinion there, but tourism obviously is a growing industry in Alaska. You know, there's a picture of Juneau. In recent years, there have been 7 tour ships on some days in Juneau. That's a lot of people. Denali Park, this is actually some birders at Potter Marsh looking at trumpeter swans, but tourism, wildlife watching, this is a growing industry in Alaska, and it's sustainable if we manage it correctly. It is really valuable. This looks just at national park visitation in Alaska. 3.3 million visitors came to Alaska last year, 2023, injecting 2.3 billion into Alaska's economy. This is a big deal. And I think the challenge is for us to make sure that we continue to provide a good experience for the visitors where they want to come back. So you've got to look at a carrying capacity. How much can the area sustain in terms of future growth? And Juneau, some of the people in Juneau are not very satisfied when tourists outnumber local people on the streets, or when helicopters are flying over residential areas to take people on helicopter tours. Sitka has also had some concerns about this. So we need to work carefully and manage that development opportunity so it's done well and it's in balance with the carrying capacity of the earth. Commercial sport and subsistence fishing is a critical industry in Alaska. It's the highest private employer of people in the state. Annual economic impact of seafood industry is estimated at about $6 billion. Annual economic impact of recreational or sport fishing, about $1 billion. This is a big deal. And we have done a pretty good job of managing our fisheries. Although you've heard about the Chinook salmon and the chum salmon in the Yukon River, that's a serious problem. You're going to hear more about that next week from Eric. Subsistence fishery provides food security and cultural value to indigenous Alaskans. It's worth a lot of money too. So, I think the key issue, how do we balance economic opportunities with sustaining Alaska's ecological integrity? This is a pod of humpback whales that we saw from our boat. This is off Resurrection Bay. That's the tip of the Resurrection Peninsula in Seward. Man, amazing. We just shut the boat down, and I got out my big lens, and I followed the birds, because the whales would dive, and they were feeding, and then all of a sudden the birds would just whoosh down to the water, and you knew that the whales were coming up. And man, now you put it on motor drive, and you're bound just out of sheer luck to get a good picture once in a while. But that was amazing. And we still have experiences like this. And the porcupine caribou herd, I've seen an aggregation on the coastal plain of 90,000 caribou. And the herd now numbers around 200,000. Caribou herds fluctuate. We're going to get into that later. But in Alaska, we really have opportunities and challenges. And we need to use science. We need an informed public. We need to look at a time horizon, not of election cycles, but of decades. When you're talking about forest issues in the coastal rainforest, where it takes 100 to 200 years to get into old growth conditions after you clear cut log, I mean, you're looking at a time horizon that's really long. So we need to figure out those things and be smarter about how we develop our resources in Alaska, because we're big enough, we can do a good, responsible job. And the bottom line is that how we deal with that is going to dictate our grandchildren's future. And I'm optimistic. I think there's some things we can do that are good. You can turn the lights on. I'm optimistic, and throughout these talks, we're going to talk about some of the opportunities we have, but we need to be thinking about this and planning and making smart choices. So I'm happy to take any questions. One point I just raised, was there anything here that was surprising to anybody? Any of these? I gave you a lot of facts and figures, but anything that jumped out at you? Yes.
It's a really good overview, but I just wanted to give you two fact check points. One was you said 87% of land is public land, and then you mentioned that is including native corporation land. And native corporation makes up the bulk of the 13% of private land. It's not public land. And the other thing was you said Alaska was the second smallest population. We were fourth. North Dakota has now outstripped us because of fracking, but Vermont is also a smaller population in addition to Wyoming and Alaska. So we're third smallest.
Okay, well, the last time I checked, Wyoming was short. Thank you for, yeah, thank you for that. And then, you know, the native corporation land certainly isn't, I mean, that is private land. But, yeah, I mean, yeah, and I think it's like about 1% or less. That's right. That's right. Any other thoughts, comments? Don?
John, you talked a lot about what we can do, but it seems like around a big play though, the state wildlife managers and the federal wildlife managers, every once in a while I find out that they're in conflict or some issue, subsistence of managing wildlife in public lands. Do you have any insights on that?
Oh, I do. And that's a topic we're going to talk about in our 7th session when Rick Sennett joins me. Yes, you're right. Subsistence was a major, you know, I came here, you know, right at the, you know, kind of the beginning of this subsistence battle between the state fish and game and the federal agencies. So there have been, we operate under two different regimes. We've got subsistence regulation on federal lands, and we've got state regulations that apply. And I think one of the challenges is that with the current Board of Game and the current administration, there's, and the intensive management law that we'll get into, there's a focus on maximizing hunter harvest for meat. That's the primary goal of some of these lands. But on national park lands or national preserve lands or wildlife refuge lands, the goal is to manage for healthy populations and diversity. And those are kind of a little bit different. And so there's some significant challenges there that need to be sorted out. And the federal agencies and the state agency needs to do a better job of working those issues out. We'll talk about that a lot with Rick. Yeah. Yes?
Some of that conflict between hunting and conservation, but we've got to change the environment. That puts another wrinkle into the game as to what is the standard you're trying to achieve.
Change of environment as in climate change or development? Yeah, absolutely. Climate change is the wild card. You know, we'll get into this. Just one example, our polar bears on the North Slope. You know, the ice pack has moved so far out that it's difficult for polar bears to feed on seals from the ice platform. Go ahead.
Okay, so development, you know, because it's a resource development state, basically. So there's a balance. I mean, how do you achieve that balance? You want to have integral environment systems, but yet you've got development. I mean, there's a conflict.
Absolutely, there are some places where there's a conflict. Tongass Forest is one. You can't have a healthy deer population for hunters when you have hundreds and thousands of acres of second growth forests where there's no food for deer. And we'll get into that in the third session. That's, and you know, there are other species that are impacted on that as well. Well, Pebble Mine is a perfect example. You know, the world's richest sockeye salmon production, and you know, the mine has a great risk.
Okay, but that's the topic of the day. There are other mining resources in the state that have not come to light yet. As the world demand increases, will come, and there's got to be a balance there. And that, I think, becomes an ethical question of whether you preserve it in Alaska and you sell it to somebody else, or do you do it, quote, environmentally safe, quote, or safer here.
You know, I think in my experience, I think that we need to identify valuable wildlife and fisheries sites that in the long term, you know, not looking at just 10 years, but in the decades or centuries, can we provide sustainable fisheries for the benefit of Alaska, and maybe building the Pebble Mine, there is a conflict there, and maybe that's not the smartest decision. Doesn't mean that we don't have oil and gas development in Alaska. It just means that we need to be smart about how we do that and identify some of these really critical fish and wildlife areas and make sure that there's an adequate number of those that are protected.
But when you say those critical ones, the thing that comes to my mind is creating a variety of small zoos.
Oh, I'm not talking about small zoos. That's the difference of Alaska. We've got these vast lands.
Big zoos then.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we can have an additional conversation. Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Sandy, you're muted.
Yes, I know, because I don't want to echo. I'm sorry. Did you have a question, Rob?
I did. Thanks. Can you hear me?
You know, we're not hearing you.
Okay,
No,
I'll try. How about
Not
now?
muted.
My question is,
Just a second.
I
Yeah.
can hear you, Rob.
Well, the chat won't work either. You can try and put your question in the chat. I can't. If I can get to the chat, it's not working.
Well, she's
Cindy,
sorting that
can you
out.
hear
Any
me?
other thoughts, questions?
Yes, Rob, could you try again?
okay, how about now?
I can
Can you
sort of.
hear me now?
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, I believe, our presenter referred to 4 species of bear in Alaska. I can only think of 3. What's the 4th?
okay, he said you referred to 4 species of bear in Alaska?
3.
Oh, 3.
3.
Three.
Brown bear and grizzly bear, same species. Polar bear, black bear, and brown bear.
Polar bear, black bear, brown bear.
Right. Okay, thanks.
I wanted to ask.
Yes, they are. Yeah, they need that ice platform to fish from, to gather their food. And walrus in the Chukchi Sea, for example, are starting to haul out on land. When an airplane flies over or a snow machine comes by, sometimes they'll stampede and they kill a lot of the pups. I mean, that's just one anecdote. But walrus, that's a big issue. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yes.
When you get in subsequent sessions into more of a discussion of, you know, the policy-making apparatus, I hope you will be able to address impact of the new Supreme Court decision getting rid of the Chevron doctrine, which has basically had courts tend to defer to to the judgment of experts who are employed by government agencies and spend their whole career knowing in great detail and nuance the issues, and instead we're going to have a bunch of appointed judges making these calls, without knowing what they're talking about.
Yeah, great point. That's a big issue. And there are kind of two sides of that. I spent a lot of time working on the Tongass dealing with the Forest Service. The Forest Service has made a huge change, of course, but in the early days, man, we were beating our heads against the wall to get the Forest Service leadership to understand that old growth forest was really valuable. So the Chevron doctrine, where they were giving the decision-making value to the agency, didn't work very well, because the agency had a very focused attitude of trying to get the cutout. But I understand what you're saying. I think the Forest Service now, we'll get into this in the Tongass session, but they've made a major change. I mean, this administration has an old growth amendment that would end old growth logging on federal lands in the United States. That's what a shift. But it took about 50 years to get there. Great point. Yeah. I'll see if I can get a little help on that. Any other thoughts? Questions? Yes.
I'm a volunteer with the Alaska National Refuges, and therefore there's a huge diminishing resources for research scientists, biologists. And I just want to bring that as a point, and I don't know how that affects retaining conservation within the state of Alaska. And I know there's a balance because there's also state research biologists as well. But that's a concern that has definitely surfaced. And, if we don't have the facts and figures of the changes in resources, it makes it difficult to assert needs and other changes.
Oh,
Can you repeat that part?
as I understand it, and I agree, that there are diminishing resources for staff and for research. Research costs a lot of money. And if we don't have the data, scientific data, how do we make good decisions? That's a really good point. Our daughter works for the Alaska Science Center, USGS. She's a seabird biologist. And, they're always hustling for money and trying to get the job done. And some of Alaska's opportunities with these vast intact landscapes cost money in boats and helicopters and airplanes to get out and try to learn how these things work. One of the opportunities we have in Alaska is that we still have naturally functioning ecosystems. Take salmon, for example. We've done a good job, by and large, managing salmon in Alaska. Look at Washington State, where I grew up. Look at the Columbia River. Just, a fraction of what it was. And in Oregon and Washington and California, they really are struggling with threatened and endangered populations of salmon. And, we don't have those problems yet, although we really have challenges in the Yukon-Kuskokwim area with chum salmon and Chinook salmon. So.
This is a salmon question, which is, do you have any knowledge about, since COVID, and especially since the war in Ukraine, Russia has been flooding the market, the traditional Alaska customers for, seafood, Japan, Korea, etc. Are they doing any kind of a decent job of managing their salmon fisheries as compared with Alaska? We're having, population decline probably because of climate change, but how are the Russians doing?
I can't answer that question specifically. Eric, next week, might be able to answer that. And Margaret Williams, who worked for the World Wildlife Fund in Alaska, and she was the coordinator of the U.S.-Russia Conservation Program. And that'd be a great question for Margaret. And she'll be the second to last presenter. But right now, as I understand it, we're really struggling. Russian scientists are not communicating with us. We used to have lots of collaboration. That collaboration's gone away, and that's really a dangerous thing. So, yeah, you raise a really important question. Yes?
On this ecological integrity, there's got to be questions about how well it's understood, especially with return of rising temperature, the climate change things. So that what is a ecologically integrity of a particular system now is in flux.
Absolutely. And I was talking, I'm not a climatologist, but I was talking to a climatologist this fall, and they're really having challenges predicting weather because they use weather models, but things are changing so fast now that, they're just having a hard time predicting. And, let's take salmon. I'm not a salmon biologist, but we get these atmospheric rivers, and we get them in the fall, say, and the salmon have just laid their eggs in the stream, and we get this flooding. So for salmon, that may result in scouring of the stream, washing out the gravel, or putting silt over the eggs. So that's a problem with salmon. And Eric can talk about that much better than I can. Or in Ketchikan, Southeast Alaska, they've had these summer droughts, which are kind of unusual, but they do get them. And if there are a lot of salmon in the stream that are spawning in these small streams, and especially where the riparian buffer, the stream side buffer of timber is gone, and those streams temperatures increase, well, the salmon, you see, I've got pictures from Fish and Game folks that have sent to me that you see hundreds and thousands of salmon carcasses because the dissolved oxygen gets used up and they can't, they suffocate.
Aside from impact for people from clear cutting, things like that, because I've heard stories, I've read things recently that said that the lobster population is moving north in the Atlantic because of changes in temperature. And there was something about a secondary species of salmon up in northern Norway and into Russia. So there's flexes that, this ecological integrity is, as I repeat, in flux.
Oh yeah, I'm in total agreement. That's an issue. And we need to have a lot of research, and we need to try to understand those systems. Another issue, I don't want to get in trouble here, but, we're pumping, how many pink salmon fry get released in Prince William Sound? Yeah, 1 billion with a B. And there's concern about,
That's changing the ecological system.
oh yeah, there's concern about pink salmon competing with seabirds, and they see in high pink salmon years, you see a decline in reproduction of seabirds. There's some concern about competition for food with Chinook salmon and coho salmon. I mean, you can ask Eric that next week, and he'll have a lot more intelligent response than I do. But there are a lot of things going on. And again, we need to have a time horizon much broader than the next election. We need to be thinking about these issues and gathering good scientific information so we can make intelligent choices. There's a lot of work to do. I think in Alaska, we have opportunities in that we still have intact ecosystems. They don't have the same kind of opportunities in Washington where I grew up. Yes? Oh, huge, huge. And, we have some invasive species here in Alaska, but further south, we were just in Eastern Washington for my 55th college reunion. And we went on a hike, and most of the plants we saw were invasives. Lots of wheat, of course, but these are in the non-wheat fields. Yeah, they're having a tremendous impact. And there's a aquatic plant that's invasive, that's in a lot of the little ponds and so on. Thank you. And float planes land there, and they pick up those pieces of the plants, and they land in another pond, and they distribute them. Or sometimes you have fishermen with boots that catch these pieces. So yeah, that's a really big issue. And the classic example are rats on seabird islands. Rats have been introduced inadvertently from shipwrecks or boats that have gone ashore, and they've just destroyed seabird islands. And there's been a big effort by the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nature Conservancy to try to eradicate rats with poison and other sources. Cats. I work for Audubon. This was a big controversy within the organization because people love their cats, but cats, take, I forget what the number is, 1 billion birds and small mammals. What? Yeah, yeah, right. That's right. Yes. There are. And that's a good question for Eric next week. I'm not, but northern pike is a real big issue on trout and salmon, native populations of fish. So. Fish? Tick. Yes, the state veterinarian at Fish and Game is monitoring that. There are ticks in Alaska. They're actually avian ticks. My daughter's figured that out because she's had some on her, when they're working in burrows. But so far, I just heard a little bit about this. There aren't any ticks in Alaska that cause Lyme disease for humans. But moose have ticks, and if moose get infested with ticks, they can't survive the winter. They have no insulation. So deer in southeast Alaska have ticks, but there's a real concern. Fish and Game has a policy on introductions to Alaska where they are very concerned and they look very closely and try to reduce the problems of introducing diseases or, ectoparasites or whatever. So that's a big issue. So far, I don't believe it's in Alaska, but it's a big issue in Wyoming and elsewhere in the U.S. I'm not an expert on that at all, but they're monitoring that. One interesting thing, and we'll talk about this probably in some detail, the Mulchatna caribou herd. There's that herd numbered 200,000 some years ago and has declined now to about 12,000. And Fish and Game did a major predator control on brown bears on that issue. But that herd has a high prevalence of, help me, brucellosis. Thank you, senior moment. A high prevalence of brucellosis, which causes abortion and reduces productivity and sometimes death. I think it's hoof and mouth disease, but it affects the female reproduction, causes abortion in the first pregnancy. Sometimes the cow caribou will survive that and go on and reproduce again, but it has an impact on the productivity of a population. Any other questions? Getting into some things that I'm not an expert on.
Well, you mentioned the ecosystems being really a criteria to look at. And in my kind of pigeonholing thinking, who addresses that? Geologists, geographers, climatologists, or is it just a total collaboration?
Well, I think it needs to be a collaboration. And, you know, I started out studying, well, I did my graduate work on elk in Washington Cascades, but I started studying black-tailed deer and then went on to bears. And, you know, all of these things are related. And you look at salmon, for example, and I mentioned that, you know, I did some work going through the literature, and like there are about 200 species of vertebrates and invertebrates that feed on salmon. So, you know, if something happens to salmon for whatever reason, whether they're overfished, and I don't think that's a big issue in Alaska. We've done a good job with that, but climate change can have a real impact under certain circumstances. Then that's going to affect a whole lot of other species. And we'll get into some of these things in much more detail. But it takes a lot of people, and not just looking at big game species. A lot of my work has been with big game species, but you know, understanding the habitat, you know, the importance of different kinds of habitat at different times of the year. So, and you know, again, coming back to Alaska, in Washington State, they don't have the opportunity of really understanding the relationship of old growth forest to some of these species because they're just relic pieces of old growth forest left. And on the East Coast, it's, you know, in the lake states, it's even more of a problem. But we have the opportunity. And one example, sea otters. They were, you know, extirpated down the British Columbia, southeast Alaska, into Washington State, and researchers and managers captured sea otters from the Aleutians and reintroduced them. I mean, that's one of the opportunities. Marbled murrelets, and Matt Kirchhoff will cover this. He did research on marbled murrelets. They're threatened in the lower 48 states. And Alaska, southeast Alaska, is the epicenter for the most productive marbled murrelet populations on Earth. And we have some of the highest density brown bear and black bear populations on Earth. So Alaska is in an enviable position, but the reason is that we're 300 to 100 years behind the rest of these states and countries that have, you know, converted so much of their land to whatever, you know. Well, outside my expertise a little bit, but I mean, they disturb wildlife. Yeah. That, I think DNR and Fish and Game Habitat Division have looked at that a bit. If you go up to Chugach State Park, there are signs of, you know, you can't use a snow machine on this side. I think that's more of a recreational kind of keeping people out of each other's way. But they don't open Chugach Park to snow machines until there's a certain amount of snowfall on the ground. And on the Kenai Peninsula, I've flown over the Kenai a lot, and you can see tracks, you know, significant impact and erosion from snow machine use in some portions of the Kenai. And then the disturbance issue. Yellowstone Park has dealt with that quite a bit. You know, whether it's a moose or a bison or whatever, you know, those animals, winter's really a struggle, and they're trying to maintain their fat reserves and their body condition, and anything that's done to put extra stress or extra energy expenditure to avoid some disturbance reduces their survivorship over winter. So yeah, lots of issues.
Will you be talking about the impact that population has? I mean, the state of Alaska has far fewer people than many of the other states.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's more than just the years.
Oh yes, absolutely. That was the density, that density slide I had. That's going to be a little bit out of my focal area of this presentation, but certainly human population density is a huge factor. Probably a factor in COVID, you know, how that got originated. So, yeah, I mean, we can't, the Earth has finite resources, and we cannot continue to expand without reaching some limit. And we've reached that limit in some portions of the globe, and we need to be smart. You know, how do we measure economic growth? How do we measure quality of life? Those are all issues that need to be addressed.
John, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Not really a question, but it got me thinking here about just, you know, you say we're New England or the East Coast was 300 years, and that's the reason they have development that they do. And the Pacific Northwest was maybe 75, 150 years ago. And it just seems that Alaska's in such a different place. I think about my grandchildren. I go, what will they have? We have such different conditions here, and we have so much federal land. But it puts, so that doesn't seem like, you know, at 300 years we'll necessarily be in the same place in terms of development. But we have this awful problem with climate change that is almost a problem beyond our state level. So as a conservation, it makes me just go, where on earth do you begin to address some of these issues? 6-degree raise in temperature in the Arctic of Alaska, what do I do about that? And I don't expect an answer, it's just sort of like, wow.
Well, you can't just say wow, because I know you aren't, and you have to think of your grandchildren, and one thing you need to do is vote.
Yeah, right, exactly. Of course I do.
We all need to vote, and whatever you just use your judgment and think about the future. Have that time horizon out there. You know, rely on science. And the science is clear on climate change. I mean, we need to change our ways. We need to start using renewable energy more, and it's going to take a while. But I think that Alaska is really unique in terms of we have, I wrote it down, I don't remember it, but we have significant carbon storage in Alaska from a national standpoint. I mean, really significant. The Tongass Forest and the Chugach Forest, those old big trees, store amazing amounts of carbon. You know, peatlands, we have lots of wetlands and lots of peatlands, they store a lot of carbon. The boreal forest, the problem with boreal forest is that we're having more forest fires, and you know that's putting carbon in the atmosphere. So there are lots of issues there to consider. But I don't think it's a lost cause. We just need to be smart, and we need to vote, and need to be thinking about our grandchildren.
Thinking of all the carbon stored in the peat, what about the melting permafrost?
Oh, well, that's reducing, that's getting carbon into the atmosphere and methane. That's another problem. Methane is many times more potent than carbon.
It doesn't last as long.
Yeah. So I think we're probably getting close to the end. I really appreciate you and your great questions. Thank you for coming here today. We'll see you hopefully tomorrow or next week.